and I want to welcome you to our, what I'm calling our special bonus event. How could we bring Meg Harris-Williams to London and not have her talk about Meltzer? Meg both has an interesting personal history with Meltzer, which she'll share with you about, and also a very rich writing relationship with him that she'll also share with you about. So we're very, very grateful to have her with us. She mesmerized us, stimulated us, and endeared herself to us yesterday. And it was really a wonderful day, and I expect the same today, no pressure. We're going to have a fairly informal schedule today. Meg is going to talk for about an hour or so, maybe a little longer if she gets in the zone. And then we'll take a short break and have an open time for discussion. It's nice to have a little bit smaller group so we can really get into it. So let's give a warm LA, PCC, NCP welcome to Meg Harris-Williams.
Thank you. I had a very nice day yesterday, and I was really happy that people were so welcoming and friendly. It was a great atmosphere, and like Jennifer says, we're a smaller group today, so I hope everybody's going to say lots. And Jenny Langham said to me, I said, I don't know what I'm going to say today. And Jenny said, why don't you borrow that old phrase of Beyond's, you know? I said, which one? You know? So, that one where he says, I can't wait to hear what I've got to say. Yeah. I thought, well, I can't really follow in his footsteps, so I've actually got various sort of bits of notes, and I'm going to do a mixture of reading out a few bits, and then kind of, rambling on a bit. So, but, yeah, just to summarise first kind of my relationship with Don Meltzer. First of all, I met him when I was age 7, and I was a very difficult 7-year-old, and I'm going to tell you all about that, but I had a lengthier analysis with him as a child and adolescent, so I kind of grew up with him. He was like my third parent, you know. And then simultaneously with the end of my analysis, my father died completely suddenly and unexpectedly in 1969 when I was 18. And then my mother, they'd been great friends with Don, kind of behind my back, as it were, you know, all those many years. And I didn't give permission, I can tell you. But not long after that, to all the psychoanalytic community's great disapproval, my mother did actually marry Don, and they continued to work much more abroad actually than in London. You know, they were very keen on teaching and kind of on starting new groups. That was their thing, was seeding new groups in as many places as possible, and getting everything out of London, where London had become a bit of a claustrum. You know, some people wanted to keep everything in London, and they wanted to get everything out of London. And so I continued. Because of that, and I might have done anyway, but I continued working with him because we always discussed everything in the family. I was a literary student at the time, and my mother was basically a literary person too, and so was my sister. So we had these great family discussions, or arguments you might call it, about all sorts of things. And in fact, that was the reason why I moved from Cambridge to Oxford, was because my parents were moving to Oxford, where they were trying to start up more of a psychoanalytic community there, because even Oxford didn't have psychoanalysts. So, and so I went there really so that we could all meet at weekends and have arguments and discussions around the kitchen table. So really it was like my family were far more my supervisors for my postgrad studies than my actual university teachers were as a postgraduate. It was different before. My undergraduate teachers were great, but I didn't like the postgraduate ones at all, but I didn't care because I went to be supervised with my family, you know. So we carried on working together, and that was what, after my mother's sort of very sudden tragic death after an accident, which the accident was 84, but she died in just 87, 86, and then we had, I think because of that, Don wanted to produce a book that kind of encapsulated what we've been doing as a family, as it were, all those years. And that's when he came out with the Apprehension of Beauty, and he asked me to write a couple of chapters for that. So I wrote one chapter called Holding the Dream, which was about really the nature of literary criticism and what I wanted out of literary criticism and how I thought it fitted in with the psychoanalytic process, because I was always horrified by Freudian psychoanalytic interpretation, and I thought it was incredibly reductive, and kind of I thought, who is anybody to sort of talk about the great poets like Keats, Milton and Shakespeare as if they were in a position to analyse them, you know. I thought that's so arrogant, it's just beyond belief. There's got to be another method of joining psychoanalysis to literature without being reductive on either side, you know. So I kind of wrote that little essay using actually a lot of ideas from Adrian Stokes, who'd basically done the same thing with art and psychoanalysis, to say there's not a reductive relationship, but there can be quite a different relationship in which they sort of feed each other. So I kind of borrowed Adrian Stokes' ideas, and instead of art, I said poetry, and say, well, psychoanalysis and poetry can fit together in this sort of way, which I call holding the dream, which is, well, basically the usual thing about reverie and a kind of counter-transference relationship and so on. I said that's what we need. That's the relationship we need between literature and psychoanalysis. And that's kind of what had come out of all my previous experience, like with my analysis with Don and so forth. And he also asked me to write an essay about Hamlet to illustrate aesthetic conflict, the concept of aesthetic conflict, which was actually a literary concept really in the first place, because it comes out of Milton, Paradise Lost, when Satan has his first sight of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And that's what he feels, the conflict of contraries between love and hate and the desire to know more about what is going on in Eden. And that's where the phrase second thoughts comes from, that Bion uses for his book. He gets that from Milton, and it comes from God having Satan's distress that God has had second thoughts about the angels and has created this other race called man instead. In other words, Satan's in the position of saying, God, he's found this new baby and he thinks it's better than me, you know. So all that stuff happens when Satan has kind of dragged himself out of hell and kind of waded across the universe, found Earth hanging in a little golden, like a little ball hanging from a golden chain from heaven, which is up there. And so Satan said, God, what has God done now? You know, he's created this beautiful little thing called Earth, and he goes a bit further and gets past the angelic guards, and he says, God, he's created these beautiful creatures called man and woman, you know, and he's just so full of what Don calls hot envy, which is the aspirational kind. Because without hot envy, you don't really get very far. So Satan's conflict is between hot envy and cold envy, and he calls it's the war between love and hate, and he can't stand this hot envy for very long, so eventually it sort of metamorphoses into cold envy. And so Satan, instead of being a sort of glorious flaming archangel, ends up just being a serpent and then bites Eve, etc. So that's Milton's view of how the story goes, and that's basically the psychoanalytic view if you consider it from Bion's point of view of love, hate and knowledge, or Meltzer's point of view of aesthetic conflict. So so that book is basically putting the aesthetic conflict into a concept, into a framework. And so Don said to me, write an essay about Hamlet, because we just had a little new Imago group meeting talking about Hamlet, and I said, well, only Hamlet, and he said, yeah, it's all in there. And it was, because that chapter got longer and longer and longer. So that book, that's how that book sort of came into being, really. It was to try to sort of gather together this kind of family family knowledge, you know, and he said, you know, it's got its roots in literature, or was it its roots in psychoanalysis? I can't remember. But he said it was like a tree, and its branches were kind of waving wildly around in philosophy and theory of art and poetry and literature and so forth. So it was trying to put psychoanalysis in that sort of context. So, and then of course I always carried on working with him. I always read his stuff and he always read my stuff, and he never said, I mean, he never told me to do it. He never expressed any opinions about literature as such. You know, he let me read the literature, and then he said, it's too long. or something like that, and I thought, right, okay, I know what to do. But he would never, you know, he wouldn't sort of interfere with, because he knew that sort of when I was reading the poetry, that was me and the poet, it wasn't anybody else, you know. So he let me do that, and then he'd let me know whether it had come across or not, or whether it needed reshaping. So that was the kind of relationship we had, and then sort of in return I kind of edited some of his spelling mistakes. So I don't know if you call that a collaboration or not, but yeah. So you know, I thought perhaps what I thought I might do. I mean, there's been a new edition of Don's works in Spanish which just came out, and they asked me to write an introduction for. They've been out of print in Spanish for quite a long time, for a long history of reasons. So a new young publisher called Paradisos wanted to produce them. We said, yeah, that's great, because you know the old one sort of folded up. And they said, would I just write a little introduction just to summarise his books? And I thought I might read that. I asked Jennifer. I said, people are going to know all this anyway, and she said, didn't you? Well, there's no harm in just repeating it. It's not terribly long, so I thought I'd start with that, and then I thought I'd say more about aesthetic conflict and how it relates to catastrophic change, because I think, from my point of view, those are kind of the two most useful psychoanalytic concepts when you're talking about literature. Aesthetic conflict and catastrophic change, they come up in absolutely everything. Every work of literature is about those. Every poetic drama is about those things. So I thought I'd talk more about that, and then sort of see what happens. I could talk more about. There's some other of his favourite concepts that I really like too. One's the combined object, and the other one I'd like to talk a bit about Don's ideas on symbol formation, what he meant by symbol formation, and how important it was, and how really that's what psychoanalysis was about. Really was trying to create symbols between the analyst and the patient that would sort of contain the meaning of the psychoanalytic process, because he always, from the very beginning, focused on the process as being the aesthetic object and the important thing. And I think some people didn't like that, so that's intersubjective or something. But I mean, what if it is intersubjective? Because I mean, it is about the relationship, and beyond what you're saying, it's about the link, that the emotion or turbulence comes out of the relationship. So I thought I'd say more about symbol formation as well, because of course that's also got, you know, absolutely crucial links with literature, because I mean that's what literature is about. It's about the poet searching for the symbol of the experience. So, and often symbols used in a slightly different way. So it's quite useful to clarify what he means by symbol formation. So that's kind of my plan for the first bit of this morning, and I'm sure everybody will have things to say. So first of all, it's kind of rather basic, and I apologise if you all know this already, but as I say, it's not so long. So okay, so Meltzer had a special interest in teaching, which he regarded as closely related to the practice of psychoanalysis, a form of intimate education. And he saw the dissemination of ideas as a mysteriously transferential and identificatory process of inspiration rather than of dogmatism. It's a process that flourishes in atelier-style groups or between individuals rather than in larger institutions or schools of psychoanalysis, which he regarded with some suspicion as liable to promote hierarchical rigidity and as useful only for housekeeping functions, as he called it. Apologise to the housekeepers, because that's the worst job of all, don't you? That's where the real work lies, I know. But anyway, that was his view, and that was a lot to do with his quarrels with the society. So I'd like to talk about some of the psychoanalytical ideas that inspired him and that are recorded always in the context of the clinical practice in his books. You know, for him, clinical practice was everything, and there's no point having ideas that didn't come out of clinical practice. So he said that the one talent he discovered in himself was that of reading dreams, and he said, "The dream is my landscape." He loved landscape, and he loved nature and landscape painting in particular. So this and the irrepressible urge when he was a young child psychiatrist to migrate to England and have analysis with Melanie Klein, which he described as a wild ride. He was a great horseman too. So that's what led him to become a psychoanalyst, dreams and the wild ride. And although his books show that he was an original theorist in his own right, he saw himself as a kind of mediator and disseminator of psychoanalytic ideas in the tradition of Freud, Abraham, Klein and Bion. And he always is careful to put in Abraham, who he thinks sometimes gets missed out, just because he died young, really. So he was always very aware of psychoanalytic history. I mean, you know when you read his books that he always begins with the history of where, you know, how that idea has grown up and where it is now, sort of thing. So he saw its continuation as an organic process of combining new growth points in theory with clinical consolidation by all its workers. The psychoanalytic model of the mind, he said, required continual expansion in order to accommodate new clinical observations, and the development of the model and the method were interdependent. Well, his first book, The Psychoanalytical Process, 1967, was based on his work with children and narrates the natural history of the process. That's his particular phrase that he was very keen on, the natural history. Starting with the gathering of the transference, then progressing through the sorting of geographical and zonal confusions to the threshold of the depressive position. The process is completed with the weaning process, when the capacity for introjection is securely established, a point which was accompanied, he said, by an aesthetic sense on the part of both analyst and analysand. And that's his first use of the word aesthetic and how he's trying to get that into psychoanalytic theory. He says that that came out of clinical practice, and it was that mutual aesthetic sense, which Bjorn describes as a fit. And later, of course, he elaborated on the nature of the psychoanalytic process as an aesthetic object in itself.